Hi class, thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I will be diving into my assigned current issues topic of successful industry deregulations, specifically in the airline, savings and loan, electric power, and telecommunications industry. So there's a lot of topics that I have to cover, so bear with me. To start off, here's just a quick overview of the table of contents slide that you will reference when following along with this presentation. This slide also captures an outline of talking points that will be covered. So let's dive into our first section, giving some background into my assigned topic. My assigned topic was deregulation in the airline, savings and loan, electric power, and telecommunication industries, and how we have benefited from these lifted regulations within each of these industries. But before we jump into each industry, let's focus on the term deregulation itself. Our text outlines deregulation on page 325 as the removal or substantial reduction of the body of regulation covering an industry. In more simple terms, thanks to an article found on thebalance.com, deregulation is when the government seeks to reduce restrictions on certain industries. So basically, we're limiting restrictions that allow for a free market. So before I dive into the topics, I always like to know the why behind things. So in this case, let's look at why regulations even get established. Well, Steiner and Steiner believe that there are two main reasons why the government establishes industry regulations in certain private sectors of a market. The first looks at the free market as having flaws that have negative ramifications if not properly regulated or prevented. Possible market failures lead to major consequences, and in order to prevent this or deal with these issues, regulation comes into place. And second, there are social and political reasons to create regulations as a way to uphold the public's best interests. For example, regulations can help ensure that products are safe for the consumer and were produced in a safe environment for the worker. So how did all of this begin? Well, by the late 70s, we have this push on the government to start deregulating industries. With the rise of the deregulation movement in President Carter's era flowing into President Reagan's era, lobbyists claimed that economic regulations were old-fashioned and that industries were better off regulating themselves. The idea behind deregulation focused on supporting a free market economy where industries would not have these heavy restrictions in place. Arthur Michael Collins from IndustryWeek.com claimed that government regulation impedes the natural laws of supply and demand, which ultimately increases cost to consumers. By lifting regulations, it would create a better flow of competition and lower more competitive prices for consumers. Okay, so with that being said, let's take a closer look at these four industries where we see deregulation measures were successful. The first being the airline industry. The Airline Deregulation Act of 1978, signed by President Jimmy Carter, was a major act at the time that would restructure and liberate the airline industry, allowing airlines the freedom to make their own market-driven decisions. The new law eliminated price controls and opened up the market for increased competition of both domestic and international flights. The Civil Aeronautics Board, that once held all the power in dictating routes and regulating the airlines, was now eliminated with this act. For the airline industry, deregulation was a huge win in that it not only opened up the market, but it expanded flight routes that made it more affordable and convenient to fly. But what do critics have to say about deregulation? Well, critics argue that deregulation measures brought about by ADA's passing reduced airline competition as airlines were forced out of business. Prior to the act, there were 43 airline companies. By 2013, 9 companies remained. As of 2016, there are 4 major airlines that control 80% of these routes. Critics claim this is a monopoly. However, one could suggest that regardless of who is left standing, new airlines are able to enter the market, whereas prior, there was very strict regulations limiting this. Airlines are in a competitive market, and with deregulations in place, anyone is allowed to enter this market. Whether they are successful or not is a different story, yet an investor is still able to enter if he or she chooses, which is drastically different than in the past. Consider JetBlue as a successful example of a new carrier that has successfully entered the market. Critics also complain that deregulation brought out poor service from airlines. When listening to this argument, one has to compare how drastically different it was to fly prior to the act versus now. Back then, flying was about luxury. Today, our needs are much different and more functional as flying serves a purpose, getting from point A to B safely and quickly. In addition, to meet the needs of the airlines requiring such high profit margins to run their businesses, airlines are forced to take what an Investor's Business Daily article deems as a capital-intensive approach. Meaning, in order to survive in today's market, they have to cater to not only competitive pricing, but also meeting the needs of their customers. Without their customers, there's no profit, so it becomes crucial for them to have this mentality to attract customers to cover their huge fixed costs. In a highly competitive market created by deregulation measures, it forces airlines to actually prioritize serving the customer to stay in business. Overall, deregulation in the airline industry transformed travel to make it more accessible for Americans. Today, airlines are offering more service options to more destinations than ever before, ultimately better serving the American customer. Critics also believe that travelers are suffering from higher costs in airfare. They claim deregulation backfired and created less competition due to a less concentrated market, which allows for airlines to be able to charge travelers more. I would argue that there could be additional factors that contribute to higher fares, such as a stronger economy, longer flight distances, increases in technologies, and higher fuel prices. It is possible that higher costs could be associated with multiple reasons. To point the blame solely on deregulation measures would not be fair or an accurate statement, especially in terms of looking at the history of airline prices since ADA's passing. An article in Forbes cited that over the past 40 years, average round-trip U.S. domestic airfares have decreased more than 40%, from $629 to $340. This includes fees based on inflation-adjusted dollar amounts. Now let's take a look at deregulation in the savings and loan industry. The idea behind deregulation in the savings and loan industry was reducing federal oversight of the industry. This would allow the banking industry to compete globally with less regulations abroad, as well as increase access to credit. Critics argue that deregulation triggered the financial crisis of 2007 through 2008. Yet Forbes author Norbert Mikkel would beg to differ, as he poses a persuasive argument on how the financial crisis was rooted in ill-conceived government policies that allowed too many people to take out home mortgages, all in support of the government's Affordable Housing Act. These efforts resulted in making too many home loans to people with weak credit. Mark Calabria from Cato Institute proposes that the failure resulted from government regulations and that deregulations was not a heavy contender in this due to the quality and substance of the regulations in place by the government. When considering deregulation's effect in the electric power industry, nearly half the states in America are in various stages of deregulation. Deregulation steers away from supporting the monopoly ran by utility companies who have full control of the market. In a deregulated market, retail electricity providers will compete for business against other providers to directly deliver electricity to the consumer, whereas in a regulated market, the utility companies handled everything from generation of power to delivery. Users will be able to shop around for the best rates, and the power will begin to shift from the electric company to their customers. Essentially, deregulated industry starts to restructure themselves so that they're able to be customer driven, because really the fate of their business relies on this. Now, what do critics have to say about deregulation in this industry? Well, they argue that it caused the major utility crisis, using California as a prime example of this. The crisis in California was one example of how not to jump into deregulating an industry without fully knowing the facts or coming up with a strategy. Unfortunately, it was a lesson learned situation for the industry, but wasn't the case for other states that chose to deregulate. In fact, an article in Times Magazine points to Pennsylvania as a role model for successfully designed deregulation measures that have created new suppliers, encouraging healthy competition, and saved residents over $3 billion on their electric bills. Pennsylvania extensively researched their market for a year to ensure freeing prices would establish a competitive market. They also ensured their resources as they participated in a 5-state trading market as a way to swap power. Critics also address the regulations are needed for a successful market, and current deregulation measures within the industry are not effective. I would argue that there are also flaws in a regulated market that prioritize and encourage the monopoly over the consumer. In a regulated market, the power is with the utility companies, and the customer is faced to pay whatever set rate is put in front of them because it's the only option. I would also suggest that the full benefits of deregulation will not only be able to be experienced as states are split on measures throughout their industries. An article on Harvard Business Review discusses how the current state of deregulation is split between states who have opened their markets to competition by deregulating their industries almost completely, and states that have limited deregulation and implemented new forms of regulation. As long as we're split across America, it will be challenging to maximize the full potential of what a free market can do for this industry. When looking at deregulation in the telecommunications industry, according to Johnston, the telecommunications industry was originally regulated to assure that a standard level of telephone service was available at a reasonable cost. These regulations were in place so that everyone was served equally and received the same services. Deregulation within the industry led to a large number of new companies entering the market, which in turn led to increased competition. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 essentially lets companies enter into the communications market and compete against one another, breaking the monopolized market and lowering costs for consumers. With deregulation, we could now have cable and internet companies offering telephone services and traditional phone line providers offering internet and television packages. This was the kickstart of the bundled service packages of phone, internet, and cable plans that we still see offered to consumers today. Deregulation in this industry increased connections as access to these services are easier to obtain and offered at more affordable, competitive prices. With deregulation, the telecommunications industry transformed from a franchise model to a competitive business model. This industry also benefited from increased competition, and the new technologies that resulted from increased competition helped enhance the products and services of the consumer. Prior to all this, the telecommunication industry was really dominated by two companies, AT&T and Bell Systems. Author Hausman and Taylor explained that at the time, competitive entry for local and long-distance voice services was forbidden. Service characteristics and quality were prescribed and prices were set, by cost plus rate of return regulation administered by the Federal Communications Commission. So we can see how deregulation really opened up this industry. In terms of what the critics say about deregulation, critics pose a lot of arguments in terms of negative effects that surface from deregulation in the telecommunications industry. Specifically, there's a lot of research that shows that deregulation was not successful and failed to deliver on promises. Yet, what the argument fails to consider is that this industry is not fully a free market. While certain acts helped reduce regulations, opening up certain elements of the market, the telecommunications industry is not fully free from regulation by the Federal Communications Commission, which still has an active role in managing the industry today. So that poses the question of how can we fully know the success rate of something that is only half implemented? I would propose that the success of deregulating the industry lies with the creation of more choices and options for consumers. The fact that the consumer now has more power than ever before in the industry speaks volumes to the success of deregulation, therefore resulting in a more dynamic market. Some argue that deregulation in the telecommunications industry didn't work because of the mass number of companies forced out of business or into mergers as a direct impact from lack of regulations. Yet I would argue that maybe it wasn't the sole fault of attempts at deregulation of the industry, but credited to how these companies responded to change. By not handling change proactively, it is only inevitable for companies to be forced into mergers or to be acquired. Companies need to handle major industry change proactively and not reactively. Moreover, author Peter Kind states that companies that embraced new technology, realigned their asset base, product offerings, revenue model, and cost structure did benefit. He sums this up as he stated that the lessons learned is that the price and/or technological competition can materially expose monopoly service providers. Those companies that do not adapt will not be able to sustain their existence. Most importantly, embracing and preparing for change in a proactive manner are essential to maintain investment value. Let's dive into section 3, the synthesis portion of this presentation. So to sum this all up, we can see within each of the industries that I discussed today how deregulation has the possibility to benefit not only the industry but the consumers, a part of the industry. More competition in a free market leads to lower prices and more choices. The power now remains with the consumer, and for the first time ever we are seeing this, and it's a good positive shift. While doing my research, there were some overarching themes across these industries about the benefits of deregulation measures. The first being, regulated markets are less efficient and end up costing consumers more than unregulated markets. Deregulation removes barriers that once hindered the competition from entering a certain industry. These removed barriers help encourage and support the growth of a free market economy. In the airline industry, we're able to see how liberated airlines now are able to make their own market-driven decisions in terms of routes and price. Deregulation across these industries also shared increased competition, to which provided more options to the consumer at a competitive price. Most importantly, deregulation fosters innovation, which results in better solutions for the economy. This aspect is key because in order to remain globally competitive, we must remain ahead of technological advances. As we see in certain industries, when we limit an industry, we limit our ability to evolve. Now let's take a look at some things to consider in terms of regulating the industries discussed today. Some overarching common questions and themes came to my mind. The first being, can you truly regulate an industry without limiting rapidly evolving technologies and innovations? Heightened concentration restrains competition and undermines the interests of consumers. Regulations are restraining factors, and this needs to be considered when addressing such matters. Secondly, we need to consider cutting regulations that limit competition to encourage growth of a free market. Remember that as a society, we are constantly evolving at a faster rate than what the government can properly implement regulations at. When something is too new to fully understand, think the internet and social media, how can one strategically implement proper regulations that will not have any possible backlash to the well-being of society? For section 4, let's go ahead and look at my personal reflection on these topics discussed. I found this topic pretty interesting as it taught me a lot about the impact of government involvement and made me question how involved is too involved, and is the government even capable of regulating industries as such without jeopardizing possible industry advancements? As a society, we want to be able to compete with a global economy and thrive off of our innovations and advancements in technology that come from a free market mentality. There are economic benefits that stem from constant innovation that allow us to maintain a strong foothold globally. Yet while some regulations can be beneficial to society, like air control and safety measures within work environments, I believe we need to tread this concept of regulations carefully among certain industries. I believe that poorly designed regulations can cause more harm than good, as heavily regulating an industry threatens our ability to be truly innovative, which then hinders our growth and advancement potential. Consider talks in the news today about the government trying to implement ways to regulate the internet. Not only would this be extremely difficult to try to even attempt to regulate the complex and constantly changing nature of the internet, but then what would that mean for people's freedom of speech or even privacy? This is definitely a slippery slope. I also find it interesting that a lot of these industries discussed are halfway deregulated, meaning certain acts created allowed for the opening up of the industry, but not all the way. This 50% approach made me wonder if it's even possible to accurately assess whether or not deregulation was truly 100% successful or beneficial. In terms of my reflections, when I reflect on how this issue affects me as a person of faith, I immediately thought about how God calls us to respect authority and abide by the law. As a person of faith, you want to believe that government regulations come from the best intentions to support the welfare of the people. God commands us to respect authority and be followers of the law, so in order to please and honor God, we must abide by this. Yet sometimes this is difficult when I either don't agree with government actions or feel that the government fails to act in the best interests of the people. It's not a secret that corruption threatens leadership, and it's extremely scary to know that these leaders have the power to implement major change throughout society. It's only inevitable that my human perspective kicks in stronger than my spiritual perspective, and I lose sight of what really matters most, which is the fact that the God I serve is so much bigger, more faithful, and so much more powerful than our government. All I'm asked to do is serve God with my whole heart, which is why it becomes important to not only respect authority as God requests of us, but to work on changing our mindset to obey authority, even if that means setting aside my personal beliefs to better support and serve the kingdom. Lastly, how has this research stretched, changed, or reaffirmed my thinking and what this research might call me to do relative to the issue? This research has made me more aware and curious about the impact the government can have on our everyday lives when implementing decisions. I think it's important to be aware of the regulations in place within certain industries of interest, as well as understand the direct effect those regulations have on society. This topic alone has called me to make more of an effort to better understand whether or not regulations in place serve our best interest. I believe it's crucial for me to make it a priority to understand what our government is doing. I have maintained a dangerous, disengaged mindset for too long when it comes to government actions and regulations, missing out on the beauty of uniting with efforts to remove regulations that don't truly benefit us as a whole. And if anyone is interested, the following slides reference the resources used to create a comprehensive standpoint on this topic of deregulation in the discussed industries. Thank you again for taking the time to watch this video. I hope you enjoyed my take on how these deregulation measures can be credited to some positive impacts made among all 4 industries. Have a great rest of your Sunday, and I look forward to your feedback.